Welcome back to the Wealth Actually podcast. I'm Fraser Rice. You all get to enjoy me with a turtleneck on today, even though we've crested out of the balmy 20-degree weather. We're now getting closer to 30, but it's still cold enough for me to be bundled up and wear a sweater. I'm going to talk a little bit today about not just sort of the money aspect of wealth management, but the preserving of legacies, the stories, the narratives, the tangibles, and sometimes turning that into something that is not only a story, but could be monetizable as well. I have Brad Mindich with me. He is the founder and operator of Invenium. And my shorthand for what he does is he helps take disorganized situations, maybe a disorganized warehouse, and turn that into an asset, something that is valued by the family and beyond, and may even be monetizable. Brad, welcome aboard.
Thank you so much, Fraser. It's really a pleasure to be here. Grateful for you including me.
Glad to have you on. And we're talking about something, when I first heard about it through our mutual friend, that I was like, you know what, this is something that families really need to be aware of. Many times the management of the physical things within a legacy or a wealth situation gets lost or does not have a real expertise around it. Maybe talk a little bit about where that came from you and what you do to help families figure that out, and then maybe advance the ball a little further about understanding what they have from a monetizable perspective too.
I think there's really sort of the foundational part of what we do as an organization. The most important thing is helping clients understand what they have. And that sounds like a very perhaps command of the obvious statement, but the reality is that most people really don't. And certainly families with any kind of history or significance, there is so much that is collected, both digitally and physically over time, that unless there is a professional process in place to really document, archive, preserve, database, et cetera, the understanding of really sort of what somebody has, where things are, what they're worth, and what to do with them is very incomplete. And when you sort of combine that with really sort of the very kind of sobering reality that bad things happen, right? So the LA fires are a very tragic reminder of this.
That's right.
That if you don't protect what you have, you don't control what you have, somebody else will. And it could be an individual, it could be Mother Nature. And that's not a place that really anybody should be with any of their, artifacts in history. So we provide all of the skills and resources to give that control.
One of the frameworks that you talk about that I find to be useful in terms of organizing my thoughts around this is the idea of really sort of four sort of stages here. The first one is preservation. So as you say, sort of documenting, understanding, making sure it survives, and then graduating to the idea of storytelling. So for those families that are interested in building a narrative around what they've built, that they can take what they have, tangible or otherwise, and help to turn that into something that can be passed down from a values perspective. And then you get into the area where I think it's also exciting, which is the idea of interacting with the communities with that story. And I guess you would sort of, under a heading of fan engagement, maybe is one way to think of it. And then the fourth leg of that stool might be sort of turning that engagement component into something that may have value in and of itself and monetizing it. Have I got that roughly correct?
Yeah, I think it's really solid and well thought out. You're hired. But certainly, yeah, the way you framed it is the preservation, the understanding, right? Preservation, protection, documenting, archiving, digitizing, et cetera. And then I love that you hit the next point, which was stories. And for families, and we all know this, right, is that the stories are what matter with everything. You could be a basketball fan, a music fan, a movie fan, or just your own family history. It is the gathering and capturing and documenting of the stories, both individually and then around the artifacts that trigger those stories, that are by far the most important thing to do as part of this process, and having those be accessible to whomever needs access to it. Because the stories then, kind of your next part about engagement, the stories drive engagement. They drive engagement internally, right, with the family. Or let's say a family wants to do some exhibit at a university or museum or whatever it happens to be. It's the artifacts, it's the stories, right? And then bringing those to the audiences to engage, because that combination drives that emotional relationship, right? People feel something by hearing the stories and seeing these artifacts. We all have had this experience, countless times every day, right? Usually to some degree with that. And then from a monetization standpoint, so, this is a really kind of interesting angle because we have some clients that are focused on monetization for themselves, which is fine. And then we have other clients that are very focused on monetization for their foundations or nonprofit initiatives. And then it's really a question going back to kind of what I said earlier about understanding what you have and what things are worth, which then allows, us to work, with these families on their strategies. What's important to them? What are their goals? If their goal is monetization to support a foundation or, for their own, personal financial goals, okay, well, great. Let's understand and map that out. Let's look at what you have. Let's figure out the best audiences for this or channels. There's countless ones, private auctions, it doesn't matter, donations, for tax benefits. But I think when you get into the monetization side of it, another kind of critical piece of this is reminding families that what we're talking about is also an asset class. And that's something that typically, for these types of, let's just call it overarching archives, people don't understand this. We find this with some of our more sort of public facing, iconic artists or athletes, whomever. They don't understand that this is an asset, right? I mean, it sounds like a very surgical word to use within something that's, more creative typically, but that's what it is. It is an asset and it needs to be protected and grown.
As you educate the client on this front, I'm sure you've walked into situations where you've walked into a warehouse where you've got things all over the place, or maybe they don't even know where it is, and you have to go down and catalog things that aren't centrally located or anything like that. Maybe take us through a story or two of crazy, or then on the other end, something that turned out to be very successful.
Sure. So yes, we've walked into every possible situation you can imagine, from really, and this is not hyperbole, really. There's one client, I can't mention this client. I will mention some other clients, but this client, I will say their storage area looked like the Silence of the Lambs garage. I mean, just really, and we've seen it all. I mean, we've seen the rats and the bugs and the mold and water damage. And again, bad things happen, right? And some of those things are you can't replace, obviously, which goes back to the need for preservation. But talking about sort of the more kind of fun discovery process, right? Because there is always that part of it, the response from the clients, which then also translates off into audiences, which is, I didn't even know I had this, right? I forgot about this. That's where the magic comes in. So I'll give two different examples. So one, there's the band Def Leppard, who's a client of ours. And in digging through the guitar player, Phil Collins's home, we found boxes of cassettes, which is not uncommon, right? When you go to a rock star's house, right? You sort of see that. And I sort of asked Phil, I said, well, what are these? He said, I don't know, just they've been there for a long time. So we started to go through them. And again, maybe some of your audiences, I'm sure knows Def Leppard, or at least knows some of their songs. And we found one tape that it said Steve Clark demo. And Steve was the guitar player who passed away about sort of 30 years ago. And when we had that digitized, it was Steve listening to a metronome and figuring out what became one of their most famous songs, which is called Love Bites. And this was the beginning of that creative process. Nobody knew that it was there, right? Nobody had gone through that. So you have an example like that, and then I'll use a sports example. So Chris Paul is one of our clients, and in our possession, we have Chris's entire sneaker collection, which is about 1,700 pairs of shoes. And Chris is really sort of thoughtful about this, and obviously has quite extraordinary collection. And we were talking about, and these are his words, which were brilliant. He said, well, every sneaker has a story. And I said, okay, can you give me an example? So he pulled off this pair of shoes, and he said, did I ever tell you about these? And I said, no. And basically it was a pair of Jordans, and it had fake tiger fur on the back.
Okay.
And I said, okay, what's the story with this? And he said, there's this pair here. And he said, but I made the first pair for Tiger when he won the Masters for the first time.
Oh my goodness.
And so it's things like this. And I mean, there are countless, hundreds and hundreds of stories, across different types of clients, but this extracting of information and the sharing of things and I haven't thought about this, I didn't know where this was.
How do you get the client if they sort of get their arms around what they have and then they start brainstorming these different stories? Do you get involved in the writing down process for those people that are trying to understand their narrative or their place in history and convey that to their various constituencies?
We do, yeah. So we have our head of content, right, and her team that deals with the capturing of the narratives, the editing, the writing, the making sure that it's in the appropriate tone and style, because we have obviously different clients and different needs, right? Some are much more academic feeling or family focused, and others are written for fans, right? How do you craft these stories in a way that will engage different levels of fans? So we do that. We document everything, and some clients, they don't want to be on video. They just want to do an audio recording. They don't want either. They just want us to capture the various notes about things. So we really adapt to the process that is most comfortable, which is really how anybody who is in this kind of business would understand that you need to figure out how to super serve your clients in the way that is most comfortable for them.
I mean, one of the things in your Def Leppard example that I find interesting is with the trend in artists selling their catalogs, both the songwriting and the mechanicals, they've also got this other asset, which is the memorabilia, the origin stories, the different things, the t-shirts, the concert tickets, et cetera, around it. Are you seeing a trend anywhere along that line that helps to not only, let's say, feather the nest of the client, but for the investor, packaging this paraphernalia around the actual IP that actually strengthens the value even more?
Yeah, I think it's a great and insightful point. So typically for a lot of catalog acquirers, they're looking at obviously the recurring revenue streams around sort of this great body of work. And there are many of these clients that are prepared to also sell their physical archives, right, in some way or some portion of it, or their name, image, and likeness, or what have you. So from a fan engagement standpoint, even we just stay with music as a relatable example is, and we've done this now several times, is if a client is putting out a box set, you have the music, but then you have, here's the backstage pass that, is vintage, right? That's put in all the box sets. Here's the photos that have never been seen before. Here's the limited edition t-shirt. Here's the poster. Here's this. So the contextual artifacts are great for the fan, right? Because they're getting much more value out of things and getting things that are connective and they, are meaningful to them. And it's great for the, artist, if it's the artist is the owner or the catalog acquirer is the owner, because let's just be really direct, you can charge more for that box set, right? So everybody wins in that particular case because the value is really balanced, on both sides. So there's that sort of thing that's packaged in that particular way. But then there's also, we've sold guitars for our clients that they, didn't know what they wanted to do with, or we've done auctions for clients for, other particular artifacts. So this idea of assigning and then extracting value in a very meaningful way is something we deal with, frankly, every day. And the key thing is attaching that authentic story directly from the client to the artifact, because that's what an audience or fan that's what they want to own. They don't want to just own the story. They want to own the artifact with the story.
And so for those fans that can't sort of either afford to get the t-shirt or the concert ticket or the guitar pick and so on, do you create digitized experiences that can be sent out at scale to the fan base that they can participate in? Is that part of the offering?
It is. So we've built several, we sort of call them digital museum experiences that allow fans to, there's no cost and it's all authentic. It's directly from the, from the artist, to the fan, where it's the artifacts, it's the stories, it's, it's just walking through a really amazing sort of digital museum to, well, we've heard this term from fans when they've commented on socials, about this, is going down these rabbit holes, right? And
Right.
discovering these things. And it's magical. And what's important to it, because sometimes people say, well, why don't you charge for these things? And there are all sorts of different models for what should be charged for or not. But this kind of sharing of the, client with the fan, opening these doors, right, this to their history that hasn't been seen or told by them, it reinforces that relationship between client and fan in ways that really only happen through this process. We're all fans of something, right? And so fan behavior is pretty consistent. And that opportunity for me or you to get closer to something that's important to you and say, wow, this band or this athlete or whatever, look at what they're sharing. I love these guys. That's really important. And that extends across the board, right? And the ability to own a tighter relationship with their audience, pays dividends for years to come.
Let's take it back to maybe a different example where maybe a person or a family isn't used to filling up 50,000 person stadiums. Maybe it's the family business in the community that has a long history that the family decides that they'd like to certainly see preserved, either for purposes to communicate to the next generation or to further entrench their involvement in the community. How do you help families like that?
So yes, of course, not everybody's going to fill a stadium, right? There's different levels of clients. And so the process is really the same, right? To be quite honest. And I think that's an important point with all of this, because it starts with, let's understand what you have. Let's go through, let's figure out, what things are the most valuable, what things are deteriorating. Are there things that are off limits, whatever it might be. And pulling that in together in a way that, I've used this word before, but professionally documents and preserves and protects these things so that the family members, first and foremost, can be able to look and see everything in one place and sort of understand, like, okay, this is the recording of this is the original document, this is a business plan, this is a TV appearance we did, it doesn't matter, right? You sort of get the idea.
Sure.
And then from there, it's in terms of the engagement with the community. And if they're an influential family inside that community, then we sit there and work with them. I guess the parallel would be like, okay, you're going to go on tour, right? If it's a rock star or something, you're going on tour, and how do you plan for this? But here, it's not going on tour per se, but it is, what do we want to share with our community in a way that is meaningful to us as the family, but also shares a history and a connectivity and an emotional relationship on a deeper level with the people in our immediate world, right? In our town, in our city. It really is the same process. It's just sort of a different focus on the types of goals and perhaps audience, distribution than it would be if it's an athlete or an actor or a rock star or something.
So we alluded to the LA wildfires just now, and one of the real risks that I think people have in not only not understanding what they have, but storing it in a disorganized way or in a dangerous way. What else should people be thinking about in terms of this cataloging process and really putting some thought behind the narrative building that goes with it?
Yeah. So first and foremost, and we all, I'm sure you do, and many of your listeners know people who lost their homes. Gone, right? And tragic. And I think the process in terms of just thinking this through is, and I think I said this in the beginning, bad things happen. May not be a fire, could be a hurricane, could be a flood, could be people steal things. We've seen it all. So taking a step back and sort of looking at this and going, okay, is everything we have, is it safe? Is it secure? Is it fireproof? Somebody was telling me, the friend of theirs, this biggest concern, what was stored in his fireproof safe in his home in the Palisades. Problem with fireproof safes is that they are fireproof for a certain number of hours. They're not fireproof forever. So you pass those number of hours, all bets are off. So I think it's an awareness of that. Or I can give you another sort of quick example is, we had a client who, they wanted me to come see their warehouse space that they were going to put things in, and they were very pleased with all this, and they had extraordinary clothing. I was sort of looking around, I looked up and I said, I see you have sprinklers. And they said, oh, no, we need sprinklers here because of insurance. And I said, no, I understand that. I said, but do you understand what happens if these sprinklers go off and all your artifacts and your clothing and your papers are all sitting here. Said, they're all done. And they just didn't think about that, right? So it's stuff like that it's, even if you think, oh, I'm sure we're doing the right thing and we have everything covered, you actually may not. So just thinking that through, talking to a professional about it, or, experts around what is the best way to preserve these things, and just doing an audit. It's sort of probably maybe that's the best way to do it, is like a protection audit. And then in terms of the stories, there's definitely a process with that too. So as part of this process is looking like, oh, this is the original business plan, or this is, these photographs from, 100 years ago, or whatever it is. And if those are the most important, then sort of crafting a way to capture those stories, which can be done, one at a time, 3 at a time. It doesn't matter. There's typically no real rush or urgency to do it. But the important thing is you just need to do it, because it will give people a lot of comfort, control, and opportunities for the future.
Well, and also, if you don't think about it ahead of time, you go from maybe an organized preservation mindset to an estate settlement situation, which has different forms of expertise, different forms of cataloging things, maybe a different sorting process that isn't taking that intangible storytelling aspect into account. And you could be really losing value in many different ways that way.
I think that's a really, really great point. So first of all, just insurance. Most people are underinsured or overinsured. Right. So know what you have so you can make those decisions. And then certainly when it gets into estate, and we work with a number of estates, we've done things where it's valuing things lower, valuing things higher, depending on what it is that you want. But it is a whole lot easier when this work has been done in advance and with that thought process, because it is costly, both time and otherwise, to go backwards and to try to do things quickly when you are making decisions that are fundamentally reactive as opposed to, proactive and thoughtful.
Well, and also for family members, you're making decisions under maximum stress around things that often have emotional attachment to them. And so if you sort of front load that, I think A, you're more organized, but then B, you're reducing the risk of, sort of that intra-family conflict that I see all the time. And I sort of hear what you're talking about here. And I'm like, man, this would be good in so many different situations that I'm eager to learn more.
Great. Yes, you're absolutely right. The cliche goes, measure twice, cut once, right? And that's really the thing here is doing this up front and doing it the right way. It will save a lot of frustration and arguments, certainly on the estate side. But again, it helps you preserve your value, right? And that allows you to think really clearly about next steps and what's important to you and your legacy, going forward.
So as we wind up here, you've gone through a whole bunch of different advice points, which I think is really good. Maybe take us out here with another fun story. What else have you got that you've seen that maybe the listeners would enjoy hearing about?
So one other story I guess I can leave you with, which again, it just is that I didn't even know I had this, is we were gathering a bunch of stories and archival preservation for Bon Jovi, and we were sitting with John, and we showed him a photo that was just his name spelled the correct way, right? The original way. He sort of looked at it and it was a marquee. And he said, where did you get this? And I said, well, we, found it in a box in your archives or whatever. We digitized this. And for your audience that knows a little bit about Bon Jovi, he said, this was the show where I met Richie.
Wow.
He came to the show. He said, that's what started Richie joining the band. He heard about us. He came to the show. This was it. And John hadn't thought about this for 40 years. Like these photos and things are buried in all these different places, and pulling these things out so that they can see it, they can remember. And it's, this sounds like a silly word, but it's really magical. And it's the same process, whether it's a rock star, an athlete, or a family, or whatever, these things that just bring up these emotions and in ways in these stories that you really are not going to get any other way.
Really cool. Brad, how do listeners find you?
My email is very simple. It's brad@invenium, INVENIEM.com. And happy to talk to anybody. Just happy to provide guidance, thoughts, structure, however we can be helpful. We're here to do just that.
Super. I'll have everything in the show notes so people can look on for that. Brad, thanks for being on.
Thank you so much, Fraser. Really, really a pleasure. Appreciate it.